We've got new Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are like the biggest archaeological find in maybe like ever. This is collection of ancient documents from the western shore of the Dead Sea and Israel. There's a bunch of caves and badlands there, nooks and crannies. And since the 1940s, we've been finding little bits and pieces of the Bible and extra biblical literature. And I think the entire Old Testament, or at least fragments of every book of the Old Testament, other than Esther, have been accounted for. It's just gigantic. But the fact that now we have new ones, a little chunk of the book of Nahum and a little chunk of the book of Zechariah discovered in a cave a little bit south of where most of the discoveries have been, a cave called the Cave of Horrors, because there's dead people in there, which is awesome. This is going mainstream. And as I've wanted to learn more about it, maybe you're finding the same thing, I go and I read the mainstream news articles, and they all seem to be operating off of the same press release talking points. So what I wanted to do was pull back the curtain and get the insider take on what this means, why it matters, what happened. So I want to introduce you to my friend, Dr. John Monson. He's a professor of Old Testament languages, Semitic languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School near Chicago, Illinois. And he is not just like the ivory tower type that sits and researches things from a distance. He actually grew up in Jerusalem, and he knows everybody from this world. Super connected, super humble. You would have to pry that out of him. But the result is, if you want to know more about what this stuff means, he is one of the great guys to talk to, and just a great guy in general. So I want to introduce you to Dr. John Monson, and we're going to pick his brain about this new Dead Sea Scrolls discovery and what it means and why it matters and how it happened. What can you tell us about this new discovery, these little fragments that we're seeing floating around on all of the big news channels? I mean, if it's on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, it must be a big deal. Walk us through the details, if you would.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, as you put so well in your own videos, took us back 1,000 years in terms of manuscripts that show reliable transmission, passing on from generation to generation the biblical text. We also have in these caves that are not at Qumran, the site of the Essenes and the main region of repository of scrolls that have been discovered to date, but these are a little bit further south, a place called Wadi Murabat and also Nahal Hever. Now, both of these canyons have yielded both artifacts before and have also yielded before select fragments of manuscripts. So it's not a surprise that they would yield more, but there are collections of these 12, the book of the 12 prophets, fragments that have been found before. And now we have additional fragments of those. And it's very, very exciting. It does further affirm the circulation of these texts, the reliability of these texts, and it gives us hope for a whole lot more that might be discovered.
So I'm seeing that little fragments of Nahum, which, you know, I like read the Bible all the time and work on that real hard for a living. Not a lot I could tell you about Nahum off the top of my head. Like, if I'm just to be honest, I would have to go and brush up a little bit to even know what to look for there. And then Zechariah is the other one. Do we learn anything new about these two books of the Bible, or is the value of the discovery primarily this emphasis on the continuity?
Yeah, I think I don't know that these particular fragments are going to teach us that much more in terms of the copying of texts. A couple of them are in Greek as well, which is kind of interesting because it means that during this time frame, decades after Christ, there were already Jews circulating Greek manuscripts, not only their native Hebrew manuscripts, which is really interesting. And you think sometime, most people would say around the first century AD, the Jewish communities sort of established their canon of biblical texts. So it's an interesting little window into that as well. So the book of Nahum and the book of Zechariah, those are particularly dear to the hearts of those who are rebelling against those pesky Gentiles who have taken over their land. Nahum is an indictment, just a tirade against Assyria, who is, which is the kingdom, the worst. I mean, the Nazis of the ancient world, even though they have great artistic achievement. But look what the Nazis did to the Jewish people. Well, just take that back 3,000 years, and there you have it. So Nahum is a tirade against them. And then Zechariah is really emphasizing sort of the future history of Israel, the future glorious history of Israel. And there's a lot of debate over when that is fulfilled, but it's very fitting that these two books one sort of apocalyptic future, good future of Israel, and the other sort of tirade against those, oppressive Gentiles, that these both are found in the cave. It seemed to affirm even further the mindset of the rebels, be it in the first revolt a few decades after Jesus, or this revolt a few decades after the Gospels and Paul and Acts, that they'd be thinking about these things.
So if there was a heat map, the Qumran settlement area and the dozen or so caves, depending on how you count it right there, that would be just glowing orange hot. And then you'd get some little specks of orange going up and down the western shore of the Dead Sea. Would that be a kind of a correct way to think about it?
Yes, but this is what's so exciting about these finds, more than the actual finding of more fragments, small fragments. I mean, it would be sensational if we found another Isaiah scroll or something. I mean, yes, or we found the whole corpus. And maybe that's coming. Who knows what's coming? What I think it's exciting, to use your heat map, is that we are tracing, as it were, almost like sonar or radar, we're tracing where they're likely to be these things, where they're likely to be found. And then we get a hit and we pull in that bass and we're like, oh, there are probably more here. So maybe the heat map will change in the coming months or even the coming decades. Now, many people have been out there trying to find these things, and many of them sort of, thieves by night. So Israel is trying to do due diligence here before technology gets even further and maybe the wrong people get a hold of things. So I keep saying, it's like Forrest Gump, like lots of chocolates or like your Apple Jacks. You just don't know what's going to be coming. And this may be a harbinger of some really, really significant future finds.
Have you been in any of these caves?
Yes, not the Nachal Hever ones, but some of the other ones. We used to take hikes up there. I didn't do any of the rappelling that some of these people are doing. I had friends who did it all the time. I had friends back in the day who would climb up Warren Shaft in Jerusalem, the water spout there at night, and sneak in. You can't do that anymore. They've shut a lot of things down. But yeah, we've hiked all over those areas, and there are caves all over the place. It's just that it takes quite a bit to get down to some of these ones on the rocky slopes.
So I'm here in this cave where this stuff was found, called the Cave of Horrors. And my understanding is that this is because there were bodies, there were skeletons in there dating to presumably the 2nd century. This is a cave associated with the Bar Kokhba revolt. And these were found some time ago. Do you know anything about those, how they got there, what we know about them?
Yes, I mean, Yigal Yadin was the sort of an epic figure in the history of Israel, both politics, military, and archaeology. And he had some teams working through these areas, including the excavations of Masada. So there's always intrigue over these particular caves, because this was not the first revolt against Rome in about 70 AD when Masada fell, and the story is from Josephus, very much dramatized, the 1st century historian, that they killed each other in lots, and eventually the last person was supposed to kill themselves. This looks to be more like they died there just out of having nowhere to go and being cornered in by their enemies. So in a sense, it's like a replay of the movie of the first revolt, but it's a little different as well, because they were scattered all over the country. They have catacombs all over the lowlands of Judah towards the west. They retook the Herodium of Herod's great fortress. They went all over the place. And this seems to be like a somewhat of a fallback position. So, it's a pretty, for archaeologists, not as big a deal, but, it's a pretty horrific scene when you come upon a battle scene of destruction, or you come upon a tragic scene like this, where people apparently just were hemmed in and their messianic hope was not fulfilled in their lifetime. And so there are some fragments of text from that as well, from this Nachal Hever.
And what about this basket I'm hearing about? I saw an image of it, and it looks huge, and it looks really well preserved. People are saying this is like the oldest basket in the history of baskets. That's a question I never thought I would be asking about or be curious about. But is that the oldest basket in the history of baskets?
This is what's fascinating about these things is, key locations in the land are going to be places where you can have water, or you can have refuge, in this case, refuge, and get away from your enemies. So we know that over the ages, going back all the way to the times before the invention of pottery. So we're talking, 8, 9, 10,000 before Christ. That's a long time ago. People would run out in the wilderness to escape various things, or sometimes people argue even maybe climate change and things. There are all kinds of things going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you have here a location that's desirable to people across a couple of different periods of human history,
Sure.
which is interesting. So you get a basket from practically the Flintstones. And if anybody remembers that show, that
I remember
thing,
Cocoa Pebbles.
there you go. And then you get something here from the Iron Age, and then later on from the period of this revolt. So the basket itself, it's so well preserved and so early, so intact. It's intact.
Mm-hmm.
B, it gives us a window of what they were doing before they sort of invented pottery. And Jericho is the famous site for that. You go to that tower and you see that already, 7,000 BC, they were building a tower. Why? Who was out to get them? They were the first pioneers of hunting and gathering, according to the archaeological sort of tradition. So to have a basket from them, and a gigantic basket, is amazing. Secondly, or maybe second and third, is that it shows us a prototype of the kind of pottery that they would use later. And so there are large pots and jars that we have from later periods that actually have a kind of weave around them. And before they would actually make pots with a wheel, turning a wheel and molding it like,
like in Ghost.
Yeah, exactly right. You took the words out of my mouth, my friend.
I really
Oh, shucks. Before they did that, and without all the extras, they would just weave, they would just put strands of clay, like a snake of clay, a thread of clay around, mat it together, and then fire it. Of course, the problem is the bottom of it would typically be flat. It could easily break. So this is actually, to be honest, I will put it out there, although I don't want to offend anybody and certainly not disappoint you, but I think the basket is a much bigger find than these small fragments, even my comments about apocalyptic and the time in which we live notwithstanding. So that's a very exciting find. And think of it this way. When that basket was left there, that basket is farther away in time from Joshua than we are from Joshua.
Yes.
In fact, it's twice as far. Think about what that means of human civilization doing these things out in the desert.
I got to thinking about the same thing you're bringing up. That's a long time. So I have two questions for you on that long time. One, how do we know it's that old? And two, if it's that old, why was it still sitting in there? I mean, if something's interesting or of value and you just leave it out somewhere where we know people were, because we got 19 bodies in there, why wouldn't they have moved it or done something with it? What condition was it found in? How was it preserved? And what's the explanation for how something that old and important could still be sitting in a place that had seen so much human traffic since then?
Yeah, so those are great points. We have, these carbon-14 datings where you can take a small amount of material and you can get, by the decay of carbon and various things, you can get a sense of not maybe very specific, but you can get bumps in your graph that will show the most likely one. We can also, sometimes when we do mud brick, the mud brick, when it was fired, it actually aligned with magnetic north at the time, and magnetic north changes. So literally, when I was on a site at Timnah in Israel with Amichai Mazar, sort of the dean of biblical archaeology, back in the day, there was a fine fellow named Egon Lass. He's the real Indiana Jones, by the way, worthy of 10 interviews. He was taking clips, sections of mud brick from Iron Age houses and analyzing them, and he could determine the dating from those, which is astounding. So you have the carbon-14, you have things of that sort, scientific tools that are getting better and better. And you also have stylistic things. And so this breaks our stylistic designation because it's earlier than anything we have. Right. But even more than that, there's a burial of a child there as well, going way far back. It seems to be even maybe contemporary with this basket.
Is this a Canaanite kid?
Well, it's even pre-Canaanite. I mean, who knows who was there at the time? But he had a small garment on him and was carefully buried. And the body is well preserved too. So there are lots of ways you can date stylistically. Like a Coke can changes over time. So do cars. So do hats and beards. Things, style changes.
Not mine.
And then you can go with those scientific tools, radiocarbon and so forth. There are whole conferences and whole industries on that. So that's maybe the dating part. The what was sort of going on and what was it
And
used
why
for,
is it
and
still sitting there?
why did
Yeah.
people leave it there? In the ancients, they didn't care about lots of different things that we care about. We are on this side of the Enlightenment, and we're on this side of Herodotus, of the Greeks' curiosity of other things. Doesn't mean that people weren't genuinely curious, but there was sort of more, I think, a more treasure hunt mentality. It's kind of like okay, we're going to starve. We better take over the next village because they have food. And okay, let's just destroy their building and build our own house here. Oh, we can use some stones and bricks. And oh, look, there's some gold. Let's steal that and let's take some food. Out in the wilderness, you're out there clearly wanting to survive somehow against some sort of terrible enemy. And so I think people who came subsequently into the cave, unless they could use the basket, first of all, it might have been covered up. Who knows? Maybe that's another mystery.
Okay.
Maybe it was purposely sealed as not a treasure trove, but a food pantry. Who knows? But and maybe the food would decay, but either way, they probably just threw it aside and got on with what they were doing. It could be that the basket was already previously embedded in the ground. We know that they did that with granaries all over the country already, right through the Israelite period as well. They would sort of put a pile of stones in and then have a literal granary for storing their grain. So maybe it was functioning in that way as well. But the people who came later, unless there's some really tangible use, they're just like, fling it aside. We don't care. Here's what we're doing here. We're dealing with, we got our texts. We're meditating on scripture. God's going to come save us, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and we need a little food supply. And we're all going to die because, we're going to starve here. We can't get out.
For the person who is most interested in the history of the Bible and how it came together and how we know if the document we have sitting on our desk in front of us is legitimate, what does this most recent discovery most contribute to that conversation? What does this mean for the Bible?
One thing that it does is it affirms for us that these texts have been circulating for a long, long time amongst a pretty widespread group of people, and that the accident of history is the reason that we have found relatively few of them. So I think that it's an incremental affirmation that these texts are reliably copied down and revered over the centuries. And if you go back from, our time to the latest, the manuscripts of 1000 AD back to Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls, broadly, narrowly speaking there, that's 2,000 years. It's not a big stretch at all to go back another 1,000, another 800 and have these prophets writing what they're writing. So it's an incremental, I would say, affirmation of the veracity of the Bible and the preservation of its record.
Can we do this again sometime? I got a billion more things I want to ask you about.
Would love to do it again, whether it's being recorded or not, my friend.
All right, internet fist bump. I can't quite reach the camera, but you know what I mean. Thank you, Dr. John Monson.
Oh,
real quick. If anybody wants to track down your stuff and what you do, where do they go? Where do they find you?
My father and I are ongoing working in wonderful integrative maps and teaching materials for understanding the Bible. And that is no space, biblicalbackgrounds.com, biblicalbackgrounds.com, no space, no underscore. Cool. Tremendous way to engage the land of the Bible and its deeper message.
I will link that down in the description for anybody who wants to go and check it out. I have been there. That is very worth your time. John, thanks a ton, man.
Thank you, brother. It's been great. Take care.
All right. We'll catch you soon.